What role did the pharmaceutical industry play in creating and perpetuating the opioid crisis? Beth Macy will join us to talk about her new book, Dopesick. How do you make the city of Lagos come alive in a novel? Lovia Gyarkye will be here to talk about Chibundu Onuzo's Welcome to Lagos. Why did The Nation magazine apologize for a poem it ran in its pages? Jennifer Schuessler will be here to talk about the latest controversy in verse. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Beth Macy joins us now from Roanoke, Virginia. Her latest book is called Dopesick: Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America. Beth, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. Thank you.
So I think you were here for both Factory Man and for True Vine, your two previous books, which makes you like a rare 3-time appearance here on the Book Review Podcast.
The trifecta.
Yes. And 3 very significant, very heavily researched books in a short amount of time. So let's start with how you got interested in the opioid crisis, which is the subject of this book, which I think goes back to your reporting for the Roanoke Times.
Right, yes. My beat was, I wrote about family issues for the Roanoke Times for 25 years, and in 2012, I wrote a 3-part series about the heroin epidemic as I witnessed it landing in an unlikely place, or so we thought, an upper middle class suburb, ironically named Hidden Valley. And I followed the travails of these 2 families whose lives were upended by heroin. One young man overdosed and died, and the other, as I followed him as he was about to go to prison for his role in his former private school classmate's death. And, it was kind of one of those stories that really shocked readers in 2012. They went, holy crap, white, wealthy kids doing heroin? This is a thing? And then I just, I wasn't a book writer then. I was just a newspaper reporter, but I did what I always do, which is I keep in touch with the people I write about because I spend a lot of time with them and I get to know them. And as you saw this becoming this huge heroin nationwide epidemic, I had like 6 inches of notes from just my hundreds of texts from the 2 mothers, and decided that this would be my next topic because I had a pretty good start at it already.
What made you realize that this particular family story was not anomalous?
Well, gosh, going back to Factory Man, which was about the aftermath of globalization in a small Southside Virginia community, you were starting to see a lot of crime, drug-related crime, heroin and meth especially. And so I started reporting on that right after I did the series in 2012. Then I started to write Factory Man. And even I didn't connect the dots that the person I was writing about that was going to prison from the wealthy suburb was not unlike the person who was the accidental arsonist who burned down the abandoned plant, furniture plant in Bassett, because, I assumed just because he was needy and needed to feed his family, unemployed, et cetera. But actually, the fact that a lot of these people were committing crimes because they were dope sick. They were trying not to be sick from withdrawal from heroin. And then it turns out, it doesn't come out until last year that region is the number 1 area for opioid prescribing. So, and yet, it just sort of had this moment where I was looking at the photographs in my iPhoto, and I realized the kid about to go to prison looked exactly like the guy who burned down the furniture plant, down to the methamphetamine scratch marks on their faces. It was just chilling. Like, it just said, we're all connected. We're all at risk of this. It's just one of those aha moments. And even I didn't see it as well, even though I had just written this thing about heroin.
Let's talk a little bit more specifically about who and where, because depending on where you live in this country, you sort of think, it's a New England problem or it's a Midwest problem. Where is this most prevalent? And is it now thoroughly nationwide, or is it in certain communities, certain racial groups, class, age groups?
Well, it's everywhere, honestly. The places where overdose death rates are worse are also places where prescription opioids have been prescribed the most. And those tend to be in distressed rural areas. The death rates are actually higher there. And the reasons they're higher there is because of work issues, extractive industries like coal mining, people getting injured really easily, standing on furniture factory floors for decades. So there were legitimate higher rates of injuries there and of pain. But what happened in those early years was that Purdue Pharma marketed OxyContin in those regions, particularly heavily because there were regions where doctors were already prescribing large numbers of Percocet, Vicodin, and immediate-release opioids. So they kind of went to the high prescribers and really did a hard sell on them.
I want to talk about the pharmacy industry and about the doctors and sort of get at sort of how this got to the level it did. But I just want to talk a little bit more about who it's affecting and sort of how it was. You mentioned, obviously, the economic distress and certain industries. But where exactly did it start? Was there a kind of epicenter to the crisis?
Well, the first places where it started really making itself known was through crime stories. So you had in rural Virginia, which I center on a community, Lee County, which is the westernmost. It's basically central Appalachia. You had things like jails overcrowded by late 1990s. The drug came out in early 96. You had a man arrested for trading a mule for 4 OxyContin pills. You had a grocery store manager killed while he was making a night deposit at a bank. So somebody who was dope sick could get that money and get his next fix. I mean, you had farmers, coal miners, 75-year-old grandfathers selling everything they had.
Right.
The next place, as I followed this group of people who are fighting back in Western Virginia, in 2000, the Boston Globe runs a story that's about Machias, Maine, where there's lots of, fishermen and people mining industries, the same sort of thing. And it's the exact same story, but this is before the internet exists. And I remember them telling me they had a young doctor working with that summer. He went home to New England and he carried back a paper story of the Boston Globe, and they went, holy crap, this is us. This is our story. It's happening everywhere. We thought it was just us.
Many of the stories that people heard at the beginning of the crisis were about grandpa goes into the hospital for a routine, kind of knee replacement or hip surgery and is prescribed OxyContin and then is completely unable to kick it when he leaves the hospital. That it was sort of these people who got sick and were innocently addicted to opioids because it would have been prescribed by their doctors. But you talk about the bigger story behind that. I mean, how did doctors become such avid prescribers of OxyContin? And what was the extent of that market?
Well, Purdue, they beefed up their sales reps force, and then they sent them out, particularly in these areas where there are high risks of injury, because they bought data that showed these were the biggest prescribers. And they went to them, and the FDA allowed OxyContin, when it was introduced, to say a very squishy claim that it's believed to reduce the risk of addiction because of this time-released mechanism.
Right.
They didn't know that. No studies have been done. In fact, OxyContin's Purdue Pharma's own study showed that you, in fact, could crush it and inject it and get 68%, which is a lot of this whopping, never-before-made this strong opioid in just one hit. So their own data, went against that. But the FDA allowed them to make this claim, and then the claim was sort of, I say in the book, it was repeated as if it was a certainty. It was enhanced, and it was like a game of telephone gone terribly awry. And then the doctors were told this with certainty that addiction was, quote, exquisitely rare, and only less than 1% of people could get addicted, based on a letter written to the New England Journal of Medicine in 1980 about hospital patients, not even outpatients. So, that's why I say it just got misbranded, mismarketed, and these doctors accepted this, and they were supplied with graphs. Reps told me that they would find out what a particular doctor liked. He liked this one kind of cigar, and then they would show up with that kind of cigar. And as you know, Pamela, in journalism, we're not supposed to take free things. That's just ethically wrong. We make a lot less than a lot of these doctors. I mean, when I was working for the newspaper, you couldn't accept anything over $25 if it was a dinner or something. If somebody sent you flowers because they liked your story, you had to give them to the domestic violence shelter. And yet these doctors, thousands of them, took these free trips to Florida, and where they would wear these OxyContin branded beach hats, and then the data shows they then prescribed the drug at higher rates. Ethical bells never went off there.
Has there been any reform on that front in terms of how doctors can be sort of essentially bribed?
Yes, that has changed. That has changed in recent years. They're not doing that anymore. But it's just shocking when you think about it. So here's Dr. Van Zee, who's kind of my hero in the coal field. He's the first one to call the company on the phone, writing these letters saying, I fear these are sentinel areas the way New York and San Francisco were in the early years of HIV. And, he's really telling them, I am seeing people I've immunized in my clinic as babies now showing up overdosed in the ER. And you're giving out beach hats and free trips to Florida? I mean, he's telling them all this as early as 2000. It was all there, the writing on the wall. And he was sort of written off as a crank. He's kind of this, he's this guy who works like 14 hours a day and doesn't dress particularly fancily, and he wouldn't let it go. A mild-mannered guy, and he was just outraged at the over-marketing and the fact that they hadn't done any studies on it.
So the users end up taking this supposed time-release capsule, grinding it down, and then OxyContin then did go back, or Purdue, and change the formulation, right, so that you couldn't grind it down. What happened after that?
So that happens in 2010, 14 years after the drug came to market. In 2007, the federal government, a long-time investigation, culminated with a plea agreement where they pled guilty to misbranding, but nothing happens again until 2010. There were so many opportunities where this could have been slowed, but in that plea agreement, it was Purdue Frederick, the holding company, not Purdue Pharma, that actually got the felony misbranding charge. So sales continued. Sales went up after the settlement. And just so many places where the FDA could have convened and didn't, and could have slowed the arc of this epidemic. But in 2010, it was reformulated. It became suddenly hard to abuse, which parents of the dead have been begging for since as early as 2000. And then heroin starts coming in.
The unintended consequence.
Yeah, so many unintended consequences in the story. You see marijuana becoming legal in some states, and the cartels wanting to bring in heroin to buttress their profits.
And what about on the user end? What is the scale of the crisis? We say opioid epidemic, we say opioid crisis. There have been other drug crises before. There was meth, there was crack. Does this blow all of that away in terms of scale?
I'm not a numbers person, but the number that kind of made the hair stand up on the back of my neck was this Don Burke, public health professor out of Pennsylvania. He showed that drug overdose deaths, we've lost 300,000 people in the last 15 years to drug overdose deaths. We're going to lose that many in the next 5. And there's been little urgency from the federal level. President Trump said he was going to declare it a national emergency. He declared it something that sounded like a national emergency, but what actually wasn't. He declared it a public health emergency with no new funds and no new authorities. And there's just so much that could be done. That settlement, going back to that settlement money in 2007, none of that money, none of that $634 million went toward treatment. Treatment is beginning to trickle down to communities, but it's very slow. Even the money that was released under the Obama administration most of it hasn't made its way down yet. And so what I see on the ground, which is where I always start my reporting and where I try to keep it always centered, is desperate families making phone call after phone call and not being able to get their heroin-addicted daughters any treatment.
How difficult is it to get off heroin? And has the kind of heroin that's out there on the streets changed over time?
So fentanyl becomes a big thing in 2015.
Fentanyl was the substance.
Synthetic, which is 50 times stronger than heroin, and just a few little granules of it. Dealers started cutting their heroin with fentanyl. And it's very difficult. Once, I was talking to somebody the other day who had been a heroin user for 10 years, and he said, the first time you're dope sick, the first time you're in that withdrawal where you're sweating and throwing up and having diarrhea, he said, you're done, basically. It takes, according to John Kelly at Harvard, it takes the average opioid-addicted person 8 years and 5 to 6 treatment attempts to achieve 1 year of sobriety. I mean, it's a long and largely lethal situation. But in the age of fentanyl, a lot of people don't have 8 years. If they run across something with a big dose of fentanyl in it, they're gone.
That was the substance that was found in Prince's blood, for example, after he died. But also, oddly, is one of the drugs used in an epidural during childbirth.
This is fentanyl that is mail-ordered, often from China and India, and the kids can get it on the dark web. I mean, super scary. A 19-year-old at our local community college was caught selling Xanax, quote, Xanax, in the parking lot not long ago. It was actually pressed fentanyl. I mean, that is just scary.
So you just don't know what you're getting.
You don't know what you're getting. And a lot of harm reductionists believe that, we should be giving people test strips so they could test it before they shoot up. Syringe exchanges, a syringe exchange is a really easy access, low barrier way to get people treatment and to keep them from spreading hepatitis C and HIV until they're ready to get help. And it's often where they make that connection.
Right.
But it's such a political non-starter in many communities.
Right, because people say, well, syringe exchange, you're just putting a Band-Aid and saying that this is okay, that you can regulate this and accept it.
They say that, absolutely. They say that. The Roanoke police chief just said that in a news article recently. But all the data show that syringe exchanges that are run properly actually help prevent the spread of these diseases.
But does it help addiction? Do they help addiction?
Yes, if they're connecting people with treatment, if they're connecting people to medication-assisted treatment, to counseling. I mean, many of these people end up homeless. The young woman at the end of my book, who was the addicted user that I spent the most time with, I spent 2.5 years following her story. She's living at the end of her life homeless on the streets of Las Vegas, prostituting to buy drugs every day. I mean, that just broke my heart.
Having reported on all of this and seen young women like that in the throes of addiction, if you had a magic wand and you could sort of wave it and address the problem, what would you do? How do you go about fixing something like this?
Well, it's so complicated, but one of the first things I would do is I would make it so that doctors could help us get out of this crisis the same way they helped us get into it. And that means we need more addiction specialists. We need more doctors to become waivered to prescribe medication-assisted treatment or buprenorphine and methadone. Many don't want to because they don't want, quote, addicts in their waiting room. I actually said at a room full of doctors not long ago, I think anybody who took a freebie from Purdue or any other pharmaceutical company should feel morally compelled to become waivered to prescribe Suboxone, because there just aren't enough people. And the people who are doing this in the trenches, they're working 12-hour days. They're just besieged. Their lab techs don't want to deal with, quote, addicts. There's so much stigma out there. And, my hope is that I just want people to understand that these are people who deserve medical care. They're patients and who deserve treatment. And too often we don't think that until we're sitting in the pew at the funeral.
Really harrowing stories and an important book. Beth, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. I really appreciate it.
Beth Macy is the author of Dopesick, Dealers, Doctors, and the Drug Company That Addicted America, reviewed this week on the cover of the book review. My colleague Lovia Gyarkye joins us now to talk about a book that she reviews this week, Welcome to Lagos by Chibundu Onuzo. Lovia, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us about this book.
Yeah, so this is actually a really interesting novel that follows an army officer and his fellow soldier / junior officer, and they decide to abandon their platoon in the Niger Delta and head to Lagos. And it's a really interesting portrait. On their way to Lagos, they meet 3 people, and they sort of become a gang of 5. And the novel turns into this really interesting portrait of the city, and then kind of goes into like how these people create a life in this new city and meet all these other individuals, and then becomes sort of like a thriller of sorts and an international scandal about corruption and Nigeria. And it becomes this comment on, a city that is one of the largest cities on the continent, but also is largely misunderstood. And
this is not her first book.
This is not her first book. It's actually her second, but it is her U.S. debut, which made it really interesting for me. I think that we are in a really interesting time here where African novelists, particularly West African novelists, are getting their due in publishing. And I think she is part of a wave of new and young novelists whose stories focus and turn an eye to the continent and not necessarily sort of the typical like migrant narrative, but really stay in their origins. And
does this date to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's success?
That's a really interesting thing. And one thing I thought about when I was writing this review, actually, because I didn't want to pigeonhole her and sort of say, oh, okay, this is just, part of this lineage. But it's sort of hard not to. And I think a lot of this recent interest in Lagos and in sort of West African fiction comes from, at least in the U.S., comes from the success of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I think she really, with Americana and with Half a Yellow Sun, really reinvigorated an already existing genre. And so
right.
I really want to sort of impress upon us that this is not new per se. It's just new for us.
Right, because of the commercial success of Chimamanda, that now books that may have been published only in the UK, like Onuzo's first book, or only in English in the UK, might now be brought over because they're making a kind of commercial calculation that, well, the old, if you like this, then you might like that.
Right. No, and I think that the market for that is really there. And that is part of the reason why I was drawn to this book, because I think, like, for me particularly, when just reading the flap jacket, I was just like, oh, wow, this is going to be a novel about Lagos. And I think oftentimes there are books that sort of deal with African cities on their own, but I haven't come across any that really paint a full portrait. And that's obviously really hard and really difficult to demand of any one book. But I think that that's part of the success of this book. Like, where this book is really excellent is when Onuzo is really just thinking about the city and the ways that the characters interact with the chaos of Lagos. And where it kind of falls apart for me personally is when she sort of abandons that mission for a larger plot that she sort of needs to tidies up, because she introduced all these characters. And now we're sort of, as a reader, we're like, okay, well, what's their relevance? And towards the end of the book, she sort of takes us out of Lagos, and that kind of made the book a little less satisfactory for me, but though obviously people might find it differently. Yeah.
What's her style like?
When she's talking about Lagos, it's really meditative, it's colorful, it's vibrant, and I think the city comes alive because she focuses on the ways in which the characters interact with their surroundings. And so she doesn't try and take on the task of painting a portrait of Lagos at large. She just takes certain parts of the city, like homelessness or building shanty towns under a bridge, and she puts those characters in that situation and really just expounds on their day-to-day life. And that's where you sort of feel like, oh, wow, I'm really with these individuals. And, not to say that, you're in Lagos, because that's like a very weird and sort of problematic way to think about it, but that you really do feel like their lives are being colored by the city around them.
I have not been to Lagos. I don't have a sense of it. And for listeners who aren't necessarily familiar, what else do we know about the city, and how does that come through in her writing?
Yeah, it's one of the fastest growing cities in West Africa, and it's really being recognized as a hub of, cultural production. And so this really expands beyond. This is books as well as art, fashion, and music. And I think that's a part of the reason why this book is so interesting. Even if, you don't feel like the whole thing as a project is complete, that taking on the city of Lagos is an endeavor that is worthwhile. It's again, I want to really reiterate that it's not a brand new endeavor at all, but I think she is adding a contemporary touch to a city that has a lot of historical fiction surrounding it, but I don't think has gotten that treatment of like, what does contemporary life in the city look like?
Well, Lovia, I know from your review, and you're obviously emphasizing it here, that you weren't entirely positive on this book, but to end on a more positive note, if you could read to us a passage from the novel that shows what Chibundu Onuzo, the author, does best.
So one of my favorite parts of this book are when she focuses on Fine Boy, who is a young boy from the Niger Delta who joins Chika and his sort of crew into Lagos, and he has dreams of becoming a radio star. I think that she is really excellent in painting this particular character's portrait, and a part of it that I really like, I'll read for you guys right now. Fine Boy lay sprawled in a shed with 7 youths the state government would have classified as prone to crime. Cigarette smoke drifted from their midst and rap music crackled from a silver radio. His new friends were menacing enough to the skirt suit women who clutched their handbags when they saw them, but no one who had been in the creeks could take these boys seriously. Their fights were primitive, waged with knives and broken bottles. Fine Boy slipped away whenever territorial disputes were brewing. He had not emerged from the Delta unscarred to have his face cut up by some amateur gangsters. The Lagos boy had a radio. That was why he had joined them. It was radio that had led him into the creeks. 9 months ago, he was sitting in a bar when he saw the CNN headline, "Nigerian militants take Americans hostage." A video played of rebels pointing guns at 2 white men, kneeling with their heads bowed like Catholics at Mass. A man in a balaclava stepped forward and began to list demands in a gruff voice, as if unaware the tape would be broadcast to the world. The group needed a spokesperson, someone with an accent white people could understand. That was when he had the idea. He would go to the creeks and offer a commander his services on the condition he be identified as Golden Voice each time he spoke. No foolish militant name like Food Basket or Bread Boy. After a few months of gaining global notoriety, he would seek amnesty, renounce militancy, and become a radio star.
That was from Welcome to Lagos by Chibundu Onuzo, read by Lovia Gyarkye, who reviews it this week in the book review. Lovia, thanks so much.
Thank you.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. My colleague Jennifer Schuessler joins us now to talk about a controversial poem. Jenny, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Pamela.
All right, what is the poem and why the controversy?
Well, this concerns a poem called How To that was published in The Nation earlier this month, or was posted online earlier this month. And in the poem, which I think initially some people found a little bit confusing, among other things, the poet, who is white, is a man named Anders Carlson Wee, who's based in Minnesota. It was sort of written in the voice of a homeless person giving kind of ironic advice for how to play on the moral vanity of passersby who would normally kind of ignore you and see you as less than human. And in the course of this poem, he, among other things, used what seemed to be an attempt at like Black vernacular. Mm-hmm. He also used the word, in the voice of the speaker, used the word crippled. And it's as sort of part of this complicated rhetorical move. But this immediately struck quite a lot of people in the poetry world, other poets, readers of poetry, as really just kind of baffling and offensive. And there was an immediate sort of response on Twitter and on other social media. And at some point later, the 2 poetry editors of The Nation posted first on social media a very lengthy apology for the poem, which they described as being disparaging and ableist, among other things.
The editors who accepted the poem for publication described it in those terms.
Yes. They said they had made a terrible mistake. They realized they needed to take a kind of harder look at themselves as editors, their processes. They said they realized the poem had caused a great deal of harm to a number of different communities. And then this apology was posted above the poem on the website of The Nation. And the apology itself was twice as many words as the poem itself. So this was quite the apology itself sort of caused a backlash. Mm-hmm. Some people at the magazine, most prominently Katha Pollitt, the columnist who's also a poet, were really upset that the Nation had done this, and they
Hadn't
said
stood by its poet.
Yes, or what Katha Pollitt wrote on Twitter is that the best thing for the magazine to do would be to ask critics of the poem to write letters and then have an exchange of letters published in the magazine and on the magazine's website rather than kind of disowning the poem.
Did they take it down?
No, they didn't take it down. And then the poet himself posted a lengthy apology on his own social media accounts in which he said the idea they had come anywhere close to blackface really upset him.
The Nation is a liberal publication.
Yes.
Presumably the poet who was doing this was doing it, it sounds like, in part to raise awareness about homelessness and perhaps hypocrisy and attitude towards homelessness. The editors, in accepting this, were probably also on board with that message, that idea, as well as the artistic merit of the poem itself. So none of this was sort of ill-intentioned, right, from the beginning. These are all presumably well-intentioned people making errors of judgment that got people very upset.
Yes. As part of his statement, the poet wrote, "I intended for this poem to address the invisibility of homelessness. Clearly, it doesn't work." But I think the thing to understand, what I tried to describe in my article, is that, there's a lot of different things going on in the background here. First, there's a really intense conversation that's been going on for quite a while about representation and inclusion in the poetry world. Who are the gatekeepers? Who gets to decide? Who gets published? Who has status in that world? And you have a lot of poets of color and queer poets, people, with these marginalized identities saying like, hey, we don't, poetry is a very white world. We get left out quite a lot. But also there's a very long history of, specifically in poetry, but just in American literature and culture in general, about kind of what it's legitimate to borrow. And specifically, there's a long debate about so-called, literary blackface and
cultural appropriation.
Yeah. But I think it's more, I think what a lot of people say, and I myself, I sort of hesitate to use the word cultural appropriation, the phrase, too often, because I think a lot of different things get thrown into that category. And I think this was very specifically about a reaction to this sort of specter of blackface, which, I think most people agree is a kind of a really toxic thing in American culture, but that's also very kind of foundational to a lot of our, our music, our literature, all of these things. And there was a whole debate about whether this attempt, which a lot of people found clumsy and badly executed, among other things, at sort of using Black vernacular by this white poet, was just like, it's a place like you just like, don't go there.
I want to just get into the don't go there. Is it because don't go there because it's not your role as a white person to give voice to this kind of person or character? Or is it that because there's so little space for Black poets to do that they should be the ones to speak in that voice? Or is it because a white writer would never be able to kind of get it right?
I think it's both. And among the sort of comments I saw on social media and the people I spoke with, people had a range of opinions. Some people would say just like, don't go there. Like the writer Roxane Gay on Twitter, so she tweeted very obliquely about this. And I think she basically said like, don't attempt AAVE, African American Vernacular English. Like, just don't do it. Remember your lane. It's not complicated. And so that's one position people take, just like, if that isn't your speech that you kind of come to authentically through your own life experience, like, don't do it.
So like an African American shouldn't write in a white Southern accent, for example, either.
Well, I think she was specifically saying, basically like white writers don't attempt to talk Black.
Right.
Other people I spoke to said like a speaker of a poem is not the same as the poet. People are trying on other voices, other identities, writing characters, but just the bar is really high. And a lot of people just thought, in addition to the very idea of a white poet taking on this Black speech, like that it was a bad poem. That was the judgment of some people.
And it's interesting that all of this took place within the pages, or the online equivalent thereof, of The Nation magazine, which has a very long tradition of liberal dissent and activism and free speech.
I think there's a lot of different things going on here. There's like the debate about the poem. Was it a good poem? Was it legitimate for this white writer to even attempt this? And then there's a debate about, should the poetry editors have stood by him, or like, what's going on where they accept a poem, they've deemed it good enough, and then they issue this apology, which Katha Pollitt compared to a letter from a re-education camp. They've now stigmatized this poem. They should have at least owned up to why they accepted it and stood by their own taste and their own judgment rather than just, as one person put it, like throw this guy under the bus.
Well, that's been happening a lot recently, not just in the world of poetry, but in the journalism world overall. There was a case recently with Business Insider where they had an opinion piece that they then took down and I think even severed ties with the writer because it was judged to be offensive by some readers. And so it's interesting because a lot of this kind of flies in the face of the sort of norms and traditions of the journalistic world where, the editor stands by the writer and that kind of thing gets worked out in the pages of the letters to the editor.
Yes, but I think it's, like here we're getting into really complicated questions of...
well, we don't work at journalistic organizations, so this has nothing to do with us.
Yeah, but I think a lot of editors and reporters are being asked, with justification to think about the limitations of their own perspective, their own biases, and that sometimes we make mistakes. And how do you handle those mistakes?
How do you?
And, I should add that there was an instance at the New York Times last week where a theater review, that was deemed by some people a review of the show Head Over Heels on Broadway, which deals with, has trans characters and non-binary characters, was deemed overly flip or insensitive, and the critic issued an apology online, and the review was re-edited. So we deal with these things. I was not privy to any of that, but we deal with these questions too.
All right. Well, not yet in poetry, but thank you, Jenny. Hopefully we won't have any such mistakes moving forward if we're all lucky.
Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new this week?
So the Trump books keep coming, and I know that's hardly newsworthy at this point. We've seen so many of them, and they've been huge sellers. But there was one announced this week that I think will get a ton of attention. It already has, and will sell a lot of copies because it's by Bob Woodward. And
it's already #1 on Amazon.
Yes, it rose to #1. It's on Thursday. It was #2. It's coming out this September, and the title is "Fear: Trump in the White House" from Simon Schuster, right before the midterm elections, when everything is, I'm sure, going to be very calm in the political world. And of course, he's famous for getting inside these administrations and really bringing a fly on the wall perspective to things. And it's interesting that even though we're not that far into President Trump's first term, we've seen so many tell-alls and explosive insider accounts.
It's coming on September 11th, which is the same day that another big book is coming out. Not Trump necessarily, but similar title, similar cover, oddly, the Ken Starr book about his sort of firsthand account of the Monica Lewinsky scandal. So
more insider accounts. And interestingly, last week there was an announcement from Gallery Books that they will be publishing a book by Omarosa Manigault-Newman titled Unhinged, an Insider's Account of the Trump White House. So that'll be coming out on August 14th, and that is being described by the publisher as, quote, an explosive, jaw-dropping account. When did book publisher descriptions start to sound like Hollywood blockbuster trailers?
I don't know, but I think that probably, I imagine, I'm curious to hear what you think, that this is, after Fire and Fury, which sort of came seemingly out of nowhere and scandalized everyone. There are efforts to number one, sort of match the sales and interest of that book and the surprise factor. But then two, some of these newer books are sort of emphasizing the authoritativeness of the reporting, since that book came under criticism for, its sourcing and the reliability of the reporting.
And frankly, you would think, okay, a few months later, another insider account of the Trump administration, but so much happens every day and every week that you could put out a book almost every week that would be jaw-dropping, explosive, all those adjectives that they're using. And the other thing that's, I think, fascinating is they're coming from all sides of the aisle and from the whole political spectrum. So Sean Spicer, as many of our listeners know, has also released his own book, which is titled The Briefing: Politics, the Press, and the President. And that book hasn't so far kind of blown up in terms of its sales. I think it, of course, it's going to be more of a sympathetic insider's account. And as of Thursday, it was number 514 on Amazon. He's not necessarily getting all the media hits that, Michael Wolff was getting, because I don't think a ton of news was broken in that book.
Although it did make the bestseller list. It debuted this week at number 13. However, lower than two other sympathetic Trump books. One, The Russia Hoax by Greg Jarrett, which debuted at number 1. And this is by the Fox News analyst who is basically arguing that the FBI investigation into the collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia is without legal merit. And then at number 2, similar argument also from a Fox News personality, Jeanine Pirro's Liars, Leakers, and Liberals is at number 2. And that book is a kind of general pro-Trump book.
Interesting. So we're seeing, sales on all sides. And what's interesting too, of course, publishers are going to try to replicate the success of Fire and Fury and sign up more of these books. But I have talked to some people who are kind of worried about how this is skewing just this fascinating political moment that we're in is kind of skewing sales for publishers, because we've still seen fiction sales dropping off and nonfiction sales are rising, I think more than compensating for the drop in fiction sales. But I just saw an interesting figure recently from the Association of American Publishers that adult fiction sales fell by 1.2% in 2017 compared to 2016, while nonfiction sales rose by 5%. So I think people are kind of, wondering how this is all going to shake out. Are we going to be in this moment for a long time? Probably.
People cannot get enough of the real world.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, Greg Coles, Tina Jordan, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pam.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's start with Tina, since you've been away a little bit.
I've been away a little bit, but this is kind of boring. I'm still stuck in the tiara'd grip of Craig Brown's 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret.
Oh, there's nothing boring about that book.
There's nothing boring, and I was reading it last week, and I must tell you, I am dragging it out because it is so fabulous. And I don't know if you remember, but I picked it up because of Parle's review in which she cited this tiny detail from the book that Princess Margaret affixed matchbooks to her tumblers so that she wouldn't have to put her drinks down in order to light her cigarettes. And that just did it for me.
Everyone had their favorite part from her review.
Right. Every page I get to, I mean, I wish I had a Sharpie, except for I don't mark up my books like that. A page I just turned, she was referred to as a hedgehog covered in roses. Someone in her court. I mean, honestly, as horrible as she was, the people who surrounded her were even worse.
I'm not sure how horrible she was. She sounds kind of wonderful.
I don't know. This is a person who said once to a disabled person, "Have you seen the way you walk? Have you ever looked in a mirror?"
Oh, my God. That's definitely a piece
Are
for
you
the
guys
prosecution.
all-
Who among us hasn't?
Are you guys all viewers of The Crown? I've been
Yes.
chastised because I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Yes, I am.
Not yet.
So half
I
of
would
us.
watch it, but I haven't yet.
When you're done with your Japanese novel project, you'll watch The Crown, John.
Crowd.
Yes. And that's what made me interested in this book, because the character of Margaret is far and away the most interesting character
That's
on
what
The
I've
Crown.
heard.
I mean, Elizabeth, not really very interesting.
Can you share a couple more juicy bits from that book?
Well, I'm at the part in the book where she's having an affair with Group Captain Townsend, which was covered in The Crown, as Greg knows. And so there's this little powwow going on back at Buck House. And, the Queen Mother and the Queen and people are really
They
worried.
call it Buckhouse?
It's called Buck House, yeah. They're worried about, what's going to happen if they can't convince Margaret, to drop this man. Where will she live? That's the problem. Where will she live? And Prince Philip apparently says something very dryly, you can actually still buy houses. Like, you could buy her a house. Like, they couldn't actually put her in a royal, a castle.
Right. She's like a hot potato who wants her.
Right.
Who's going
She
to
needs
house
the
her.
royal love shack.
Speaking of love shacks, Ulysses, Greg, what's new?
I'm
We
not
were
sure I
with the
see the
sirens.
segue
We were with
there.
the
but-
sirens.
we were no, actually, I was past the sirens onto the Cyclops part, which I
no
noted
love
on
shack
Twitter
there.
last weekend. Opens with a passing reference to a character named Moses Herzog, who then Saul Bellows stole the name for Herzog, his book. I had no idea that was a Ulysses reference.
You've pointed out today that your book is actually physically decomposing now.
The back cover is coming off because I've, probably just because my bag is overcrowded, but also because I've been lugging it everywhere.
Is that a vintage paperback?
It is a vintage paperback, literally from the publishing house Vintage. Yeah,
They're so distinctive.
Yeah,
That's a great cover.
I'm actually not going to talk about Ulysses this week, though. I am still reading it, be assured, everyone. But I belong to a farm share that my local library organizes. And part of being a member in that is that you commit to volunteering a couple of hours during the season. And so last night I had to man the sign-in table at the farm share at the library. And
It's hard
the
labor.
farm share?
yeah, it's community-supported agriculture. You pay a
I
subscription
thought you were
fee at
going to
the
be like
beginning.
digging up potatoes or something. And
No, this is like you pay the farmer at the beginning of the season, and every week they deliver fresh produce from the farm to a drop-off point. And
I actually got really excited when I heard that. I thought for sure you were going to be out there harvesting, and I thought
I wish. No, it's nothing as exotic as that. And I just had to sit behind a table and check people's names off as they came in to collect their vegetables. And that means that there are big periods of time when you're really doing nothing at all. And it lends itself to reading, but not to reading Ulysses, because it's kind of interrupted time. And so instead of reading Ulysses last night, I pulled out a book that's been well reviewed in our paper, I think by Dwight Garner and maybe Danzy Senna in the Sunday Book Review. It's Deborah Levy's, or Levy, I don't know how you pronounce her last name, Levy. Her very short new memoir called The Cost of Living. And it is, it's a memoir the way that a novella is a novel. So we should have a name for these, like, memoir-la. it's like
slice of memoir.
Memoirette.
And they're very short kind of slice of life essays, but all on the topic of at age 50, she just threw her life into upheaval. She left her marriage. She realized, she says she was drowning in her marriage. The marriage was the boat that she couldn't swim back to. And so she just kind of reinvented everything. She moved into a shabby little apartment with her two daughters and tried to kind of pick up the pieces from there. It has shades of Rachel Cusk, who did something similar, shades of Elena Ferrante from Days of Abandonment, although Ferrante, as we know, stayed in that marriage eventually. But there's lots of kind of redefining what marriage is, redefining what womanhood is, what it means to be a wife and a mother.
And ambitious.
Artistic ambitions. There's also... Deborah Levy is also a poet, and there's a real poetic compression to a lot of the writing in here. She's wonderful with aphorisms. Sometimes I'm thinking of Muriel Spark, that there's a liveliness to it, but also kind of she can be acerbic and kind of furious in a way that's compelling.
That and a previous short memoir by her have been at the top of my pile for a while. I got to get to them.
So I'm really enjoying this, The Cost of Living, but also reading Ulysses. I'm also reading I'm reading something for work, and I've just started on my e-reader a book that my son really liked that passed me by back in the day, which is Ender's Game, the Orson Scott Card.
Oh, yeah.
My son read it and liked it, and then started looking into Orson Scott Card's politics. And so we've been having very interesting conversations about the art versus the artist.
And also, he should know that that's the only good book that Orson Scott Card has ever written. So it's tempting because there's he tried to do, I think, 20 sequels and prequels to Ender's Game. But I have been told by authoritative people that, in fact, that is the only good book. And it's really good.
It starts out really good. I mean, I'm looking forward to reading it and continuing this discussion with my son, which has been a fascinating and complicated discussion. You know, he's 15, and it's kind of the right age to get into a lot of these questions of real life versus the artistic vision and all of that's going on. But I will tell him to stop there.
Yeah. Then you can move on to the more superficial discussion of like why the movie is not at all like the book.
Yeah, and in fact, he's curious about the movie now, and he's been looking a little bit into some of that. And he says that they stripped out some of the more problematic politics that are in the book, and that the movie also did not perform very well. But he thinks that was maybe because there was a boycott movement against it. It was well reviewed, but terrible box office. So.
It was not well reviewed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Pamela's vigorously shaking her head.
Yeah, it's not well reviewed.
John.
Well, you're showing off about how many reading projects you have going at the same time, so I'll show off a little bit. I read 2 books for work in the past couple of weeks that I reviewed in the paper today. One is a history of pessimism, essentially, and the other is a book about how we're all really doomed because of climate change and war. So that was a mood lifter. And I've also continued to pat myself on the back, the Japanese reading project, which I did, I had no idea whether I would really start it, but once I did, I really got into it. And I'm about halfway through the second book I'm reading by an author named Osamu Dazai, Dazai. He was a mid-century writer who actually, I think, committed suicide when he was in his late 40s. And the 2 novels that I'm reading, I think, are essentially the majority of his production as a writer. The first is called No Longer Human, and I finished that. It's sort of Japan's Notes from Underground or Hamsun's Hunger. It's narrated by this guy who basically just takes very little joy in life and doesn't understand how to act around other people. And but for all of that, it's also has the charm of his voice. It's not really, it's depressing on some level, but it's a very good read. And now I'm reading a book called The Setting Sun, which is very different.
Who's it by?
It's by Osamu Dazai, Dazai. And it's about a young woman who lives at home with her mother, and her younger brother has been off at, fighting in World War II for a few years, and they haven't seen him and they don't know his fate. And essentially, it's about the way that this girl moves into modernity and moves away from kind of the idea of being, under her mother's wing all the time. And apparently, this was the influence for this phrase, the people of the setting sun, which became kind of a permanent part of their language, and based on this book and what it symbolizes. It's really well written. It's much more traditional than the previous book because it's more of a story with other characters. You're not just kind of trapped in someone's consciousness. And I'm about halfway through it and really loving it. I think these 2 they're much more modern feeling than some of the other books I've been reading in this project, which have sort of the more traditional, somewhat spare and almost riddle-like, Japanese style. And this is, I think, that people who are used to reading more modernist writers will get into this faster.
Are you moving along in chronological order with this Japanese reading project?
Not really. But everything I'm reading is kind of older. Mm-hmm. So everything has been sort of first half of the 20th century, I think, and just past. I think The Setting Sun was written in 1956, and I think that No Longer Human was just before that. So.
And is it in any way a commentary on the war and the Japanese role in the war?
Not yet. The brother has just come back home, and he got addicted to opium while he was off fighting, and now he's home and he's drinking heavily, and they're kind of trying to figure out what to do with him. He's kind of a mess. But so far, it hasn't really stepped back and talked about that. It was pretty soon after the war that he wrote this, so I'm not sure what kind of perspective there was at the time on that. So I'll look for that in the second half of the book. Pamela, you have gotten past your giant doorstop project.
Yes.
You finished Robert Toombs before I finished James Joyce, as you knew you would.
It's not a competition, Greg. It's okay.
But if it were, Pamela won.
I was in the Berkshires last week and, had one of those experiences where you had a plan as to what you were going to read next. I had like a short list of books. I always think every summer, this is finally going to be my summer in which I read nothing but super fun thrillers, and it never works out. And this was one of those instances where I got thrown off because I had landed in a bookstore and was tempted. So I was at The Mount, which was Edith Wharton's home in the Berkshires, an absolutely magical place. I highly recommend going, and in particular, recommend, if you can, getting a tour of the library. So I had a private tour with the curator there, who's relatively new. She came from the Peabody and showed us through Edith Wharton's collections, which her personal collection, which had sort of disappeared from the Mount over the years because the house fell into disrepair and then was revived and is now, I think, a thriving museum and event space. But they found her books and have bought them back. And the curator showed me what Edith Wharton's book plates look like so that if ever I were abroad, they tend to be found in London most frequently, and saw that book plate that, I immediately snap it up and send it to her so that they can make their collection ever more complete. And I will say, Tina, though you hesitated to write in your book with a Sharpie, Edith Wharton did write in her books. And that was one of the greatest things to see. Not only did she dedicate her books to people and keep books that were dedicated to her, most interestingly, I thought, from Henry James and from Teddy Roosevelt, both great friends of hers. But also she wrote in her own books, and her Bible was very heavily noted, annotated, and her John Donne poetry. And it was interesting to see the kind of books that she collected. She had a large collection of nature and science, not surprisingly, many books on gardening and home design. She, of course, designed the Mount and its surrounding gardens. She had a large collection of books in German and Italian and French because she read in all of those languages. And then she had a great collection. Of course, she had her own copies of her own books and then all of her copies of her Henry James. So it was one of those places where you just want to be like, everybody clear the room. And I just want to be here for 5 hours. But I ended up buying it in the bookstore. And again, this was one of those bookstores where you want to buy, 17 things. But I held back. I kept myself to one book, and that is A Backward Glance, an autobiography by Edith Wharton. And I just want to read a couple of little passages here. It's really quite wonderful. It's her voice. It's well written, of course. So this is from a chapter called Knee High, about her girlhood, becoming a reader. And she is talking about reading Washington Irving's Alhambra before she could actually read. Well, the Alhambra once in hand, making up was ecstasy. At any moment, the impulse might seize me, and then, if the book was in reach, I had only to walk the floor, turning the pages as I walked, to be swept off full sail on the sea of dreams. The fact that I could not read added to the completeness of the illusion, for from those mysterious blank pages I could evoke whatever my fancy chose. Parents and nurses peeping at me through the cracks of doors, I always had to be alone to, quote, make up, unquote. Noticed that I often held the book upside down, but that I never failed to turn the pages, and that I turned them at about the right pace for a person reading aloud about as passionately and precipitously as was my habit. I love that part. And then later on, even she talks about her father, her parents were readers, and they had a personal library of about 700 volumes, but they didn't socialize with writers, and they weren't sort of great intellectuals. They were of that old New York class that will be familiar to people who've read The Age of Innocence or only seen the movie. For my parents and their group, though they held literature in great esteem, stood in nervous dread of those who produced it. Washington Irving, Fitzgreen Halleck, and William Dana were the only representatives of that disquieting art who were deemed uncontaminated by it. Though Longfellow, they admitted, if a popular poet, was nonetheless a gentleman. As for Herbert Melville, a cousin of the Van Rensselaers, and qualified by birth to figure in the best society, he was doubtless excluded from it by his deplorable bohemianism, for I never heard his name mentioned or saw one of his books. Banished probably for the same reasons were Poe, that drunken and demoralized Baltimorean, and the brilliant wastrel Fitzjames O'Brien, who was further debased by writing for the newspapers.
I love that.
Yeah.
Can I read that when you're done? Can I
will
borrow
pass
that?
you my copy
Thank
of
you.
A Backward Glance, and I may still be reading it when we next convene. Maybe I will have cheated a thriller in between.
I would love to hear more, though, of Wharton next week.
All right.
Yeah.
Until then.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.